You've all heard the stories. Someone gets a rush of adrenaline, and a mother lifts a car to rescue a child, or someone bends metal doors with their bare hands to rescue someone from a fire. But is there any truth to these stories? Does the body really get a surge in strength with a rush of adrenaline? Well, today we're going to find out by learning about what really happens during an adrenaline rush, and we're going to learn that adrenaline is used by the body for so much more than just these fight or flight responses. We'll take a look at how the nervous system and the endocrine system work in tandem to regulate your adrenaline levels for everyday use, and when you need a surge of it. Plus, we have harnessed this incredible substance to be utilized in medicine, as it can be used for simple procedures all the way up to saving someone's life. It's going to be an adrenergic one. So let's get into this anatomical and physiological awesomeness. So what is adrenaline? Adrenaline is also known as epinephrine, and it's both a hormone and a neurotransmitter, produced primarily by the adrenal glands, those small hat-shaped organs sitting right on top of your kidneys, which you can see one of these adrenal glands here on this cadaver dissection. Now, this is actually how it got its name. If you break down adrenaline, the Latin-based term, ad refers to near or beside, and renalis means kidney. If you break down epinephrine, the Greek-based term, epi means upon, and nephros also means kidney. And so both of these names reference the release of this hormone by the gland that is beside or on top of your kidney. Epinephrine is the name primarily used in the United States, whereas adrenaline is mostly used everywhere else. The reason for this has to do with the history of trademarking and generic names, which are not important for this video. But if I use the terms interchangeably throughout the video, you'll know it's the same thing. Now, chemically, adrenaline is derived from the amino acid tyrosine and belongs to a class of compounds called catecholamines, which also includes noradrenaline or norepinephrine, which will also be a part of our story a little bit later on today. But just a second ago, I said that adrenaline was both a hormone and a neurotransmitter. So what makes something a hormone versus a neurotransmitter? And why is adrenaline considered both? Well, let me discuss some really cool concepts by comparing the nervous system and the endocrine system, both of which are going to be very important to the release of adrenaline and adrenaline rushes. If you ask someone, what is the control system of the human body? Most people are going to say the nervous system, and that is correct. The nervous system is the major control system of the human body. However, the endocrine system is also an important control system. If you translate the term endocrine, it means to secrete within. And the endocrine system is a collection of various glands that secrete chemical messengers, called hormones, into the bloodstream. And you've likely heard of many of these glands, like the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the pancreas, the adrenal gland, as well as a few others. But this gives us our first major difference between these two control systems, and that is how these systems differ in the distribution of their control. And here's what I mean by that. We just learned that the endocrine system has glands that dump hormones into the bloodstream. And so these hormones can go everywhere throughout the body because blood vessels essentially go everywhere. And so this means that the endocrine system potentially has very widespread effects. And I say potentially because even though these hormones circulate everywhere, once they're released by these glands, they will not affect a tissue or cell unless that cell has a receptor for that specific hormone. So like when the adrenal glands secrete adrenaline into the bloodstream, there are cells throughout the body that don't have a receptor for adrenaline. So it will just pass right on by those cells. But the cells that do have adrenergic receptors, it's going to bind to those cells, specifically the receptors on those cells, and cause some of the many effects of adrenaline that we'll soon discuss. The nervous system, on the other hand, does not exert its effects through the bloodstream, but through direct connections of wire-like cells that we call neurons. And so because of these direct connections, the nervous system has the ability to be very targeted and specific. Like you could turn on the sweat glands just to the right hand and not to the left. You could activate just a few muscle fibers within a whole muscle to create finer muscle contractions. And so we say that the distribution of control of the nervous system is more specific, more precise. And the chemical messengers that the neurons release are referred to as neurotransmitters. And the same principle of receptor physiology applies here. There are multiple neurotransmitters with different chemical shapes. And so the neurotransmitter must bind to its associated receptor in order for it to have an effect. And back to the reason why adrenaline is considered a hormone and sometimes a neurotransmitter. And that is because there are a few neurons within the brain and brainstem that release adrenaline. And so it's kind of just semantics. If adrenaline is released by a neuron, they call it a neurotransmitter. If adrenaline is released by the adrenal glands, which by far the majority of adrenaline is released by those glands, then it's called a hormone. It's actually the exact same chemical substance. It's again kind of just semantics depending on what is releasing it. But the other two ways in which the nervous system and the endocrine system differ in how they control the body is their speed and how long their effects last, both of which will play into adrenaline rushes. The nervous system can send a signal or nerve impulse within milliseconds. It seems instantaneous to us. But since the endocrine system is relying on the bloodstream to distribute the hormones throughout the body, it can take 10 to 30 seconds and even up to a few minutes for the endocrine system to have an effect, and sometimes even longer depending on the hormone. And this also influences how long the effects last. The nervous system can shut down a signal instantaneously, where the endocrine system, the duration will last as long as it takes for those hormones to be broken down in the bloodstream, often lasting for several minutes. And so as another little teaser about adrenaline rushes, there's a reason why you often feel ramped up for several minutes after you are no longer in any danger, or after the event that caused the rush in the first place is completed. But real quick, I want to take a second to say thank you to the sponsor of today's video, LifeZoom. LifeZoom is a US-based wellness brand focused on making science-backed photobiomodulation, also known as red light therapy, accessible for everyday use. Now, as a science channel, I do want to emphasize evidence. And while photobiomodulation isn't a cure-all and results can vary, recent meta-analyses show promising benefits for reducing inflammation and pain, accelerating wound healing, and supporting skin vitality through collagen production and enhanced cellular energy production. And this has actually been used for years by health professionals in hospitals and clinics for treating acne or psoriasis, managing chronic pain, and even accelerating post-surgical wound healing as well as recovery from injuries. And LifeZoom has multiple products that can help, such as their Vera Series Curved Silicone Red Light Therapy Lamp that uses FDA-cleared 660 nanometer red wavelengths for superficial benefits to the skin, while their 850 nanometer near-infrared wavelengths can penetrate deeper tissues, supporting muscle relaxation, circulation, and tissue recovery, as well as promoting mitochondrial function. Plus, their red light therapy eye mask uses similar technology for those that may want some help around the eyes with stimulating collagen production and reducing the appearance of fine lines. And for me, sometimes I do get a zit right before filming. So for more specific spot treating for something like acne, it's nice to have their red light therapy wand. So if you're interested, click the link in the description and check out LifeZoom's products today. And now, let's get back to adrenaline. So let's talk about what adrenaline actually does. And then we can apply that to when it spikes during adrenaline rushes or during fight or flight responses. And then we can even apply that information to how it's used in the medical field. Adrenaline affects multiple systems throughout the body. With the cardiovascular system, it increases heart rate and the force at which the heart muscle contracts, both of which contribute to the pumping of more blood. It also causes vasodilation in the blood vessels of skeletal muscles and the coronary arteries of the heart, while simultaneously vasoconstricting blood vessels in the skin, gut, and kidneys. So we're getting more blood to the skeletal muscles and the myocardium of the heart, but decreasing blood to areas that aren't necessarily our main concern during a fight or flight response. And if you're going to increase blood flow to the heart and skeletal muscles, you need to pair that with getting more oxygen into the bloodstream. Adrenaline relaxes the smooth muscle of the bronchial tree, opening airways for deeper, faster breaths and better oxygen intake. This enhances gas exchange in the lungs, ensuring your blood stays oxygenated. Adrenaline also makes energy sources more readily available. It causes glycogenolysis in the liver and skeletal muscle, which is the breaking down of glycogen into glucose, thereby increasing blood glucose levels and making this more available for the muscles, heart, and even the nervous system to use for energy. It also promotes lipolysis in adipose tissue, which is the breakdown and release of fatty acids into the bloodstream, providing yet another energy source. The nervous system is also affected by adrenaline, as it heightens alertness and cognition and even inhibits the perception of pain, as well as dilates the pupils for better vision. And because of this priming of the nervous system, this also affects neuromuscular connections by indirectly facilitating more efficient motor unit recruitment within a skeletal muscle and recruiting the motor units more quickly, both of which result in more powerful and explosive muscle contractions. And remember, due to the increase in glucose availability and increased blood and oxygen that's now being delivered to the muscle will be more resistant to fatigue. Also, the pain receptors in muscle tissue itself will be dampened. Combine that with the decreased perception of pain within the nervous system, and this can allow someone to not be inhibited as much by pain or discomfort. Now, when you've experienced a spike in adrenaline, you may have noticed the feeling of butterflies or even dry mouth. And that's because adrenaline inhibits gut motility because, as I already mentioned, during an adrenaline rush, the body is temporarily not really concerned about digesting your food. Now, that doesn't cover every single effect of adrenaline, but it covers the majority of them. And here's one last important concept. Sometimes people think that adrenaline is like this all or nothing situation. You either have this big adrenaline rush or nothing at all. But that is not the case. You actually have certain levels of adrenaline circulating in the bloodstream throughout the whole day. Yes, during sleep and the most relaxed states, it will be at its lowest levels. But even if you have a little bit of a stressful situation at work or school, those levels will start to go up. When you go to the gym and start to work out, your body's going to start secreting even more adrenaline, all the way up to when you get totally scared or maybe are in this high stakes championship sporting event where you get the full-fledged fight or flight response, aka the adrenaline rush. So what actually happens during an adrenaline rush? Well, the brain will recognize some sort of threat, or it could be an extremely stressful situation, or maybe even a very intense sporting event. But either way, the amygdala of the brain will recognize this and then relay this information to a structure in the central core of the brain called the hypothalamus, which will then kick off the fight or flight response. The hypothalamus activates the sympathetic division of your nervous system, which again is nicknamed the fight or flight part of your nervous system. And remember, the nervous system has direct wire connections and is extremely fast. The sympathetic nervous system has direct wire connections to the heart, blood vessels, the respiratory tract, the eyes, and sweat glands. So immediately you can get an increase in heart rate, vasodilation of the blood vessels that are going to the skeletal muscles and heart, opening of the airways, dilation of the pupils, and you start sweating. And again, this is why we wanted to compare the nervous system to the endocrine system. Because if you truly have a dangerous situation on your hands, you don't want to have to wait 10 to 30 seconds for hormones to get to the tissues in order to start this fight or flight response. You want an immediate response. And as an interesting FYI, the neurons of the sympathetic nervous system don't actually release adrenaline. With very few exceptions, they release noradrenaline, also known as norepinephrine, which is very similar in structure to adrenaline and has very similar effects. But the sympathetic nervous system also has direct wire connections to the adrenal glands. And while it's activating all of these other tissues, it also sends a signal to the adrenal glands, causing the central portion of the adrenal glands, called the adrenal medulla, to release a whole bunch of adrenaline and a little bit of noradrenaline into the bloodstream. For those of you that care about specifics, the adrenal glands release about 80% adrenaline and 20% noradrenaline. But this is the bolstering backup that's coming from that initial sympathetic nervous system response. You have this extra rush of adrenaline that now can help sustain the fight or flight response. Most fight or flight responses aren't just going to last a few seconds. Like, from an evolutionary standpoint, it may take several minutes to run away from whatever is trying to eat or kill you. And so having this bolstering effect, or this rush of adrenaline, increases the power of the response. But now let's discuss when you hear about people having this sudden increase in strength with adrenaline rushes. You'll hear stories of people lifting cars off of individuals and performing these incredible feats of strength with rushes of adrenaline. Now, often these stories are blown out of proportion or dramatized to a certain degree, but there actually is some truth to this. If you were to hook someone up to an EMG, a technique that measures the electrical activity produced by skeletal muscles, and then you told them to contract a muscle or a muscle group as hard as they could, or lift as much weight as they possibly could, you would be able to see that some motor units are not being recruited, even though the person is trying their hardest. And so, why is this occurring? Well, I'll often tell my students that the nervous system has some trust issues. It doesn't trust you to be able to engage every single motor unit and therefore every single muscle fiber on demand whenever you want. That is a potential recipe for injury and tissue damage. But remember, we learned that adrenaline allows for the recruitment of more motor units and even recruiting those motor units with more velocity. So essentially you could think, during an adrenaline rush, the adrenaline says to the nervous system, you can shut up and stop this ridiculous neuromuscular inhibition because I need to lift this heavy object or run away from this dangerous situation, and I need all my muscle fibers to do it we'll deal with any potential damage when we've escaped the dangerous situation. So it's not like there's this magical infusion of strength, like all of a sudden your cells become like those of Kal-El, the last son of Krypton. No, it's just you are now able to temporarily tap into nearly every single one of your motor units during that adrenaline rush. And finally, how do we use adrenaline in the medical field?
Some kind of artificial adrenaline.
Artificial adrenaline.
Yeah. Got heart problems.
Epinephrine.
Yes! Epinephrine.
And I'm going to start calling adrenaline epinephrine now because this is the name that is mostly used in the clinical setting. Now, people often talk about the EpiPen, even though this isn't the most common use of epinephrine. So let me talk about some of the more common uses before getting to the EpiPen. I've used epinephrine when I'm doing laceration repairs, or in other words, when somebody gets a cut and I'm putting sutures or stitches in. Most people wouldn't appreciate it if you tried to apply sutures without using a numbing agent. So we use Lidocaine so that they don't feel pain during the procedure. But sometimes I will use Lidocaine with epinephrine. Remember, epinephrine causes vasoconstriction of the blood vessels in the skin. So not only do you numb the skin, but the vasoconstriction of the blood vessels reduces the bleeding, which makes it easier to manage the wound during suture placement, and even reduces the systemic absorption of lidocaine because the vessels are constricted. I've also used it on children that have croup, which is a viral infection that causes a barking cough in kids and can narrow the airways. So in cases of moderate to severe croup, I've given nebulized epinephrine, where they breathe this in, and like we learned earlier, epinephrine causes dilation of the airways, and it will also constrict the vessels of the mucous membranes, which will also open up the airway, making it easier for the child to breathe. And this is also often paired with anti-inflammatory steroids. Now, the EpiPen is an auto-injector that injects epinephrine into a muscle, typically one of the quad muscles, and it is used for anaphylaxis, which is a severe life-threatening allergic reaction where histamine causes widespread vasodilation of the blood vessels in the skin, which results in swelling and flushing of the skin, and this substantially drops blood pressure. The tongue and airways also swell, blocking the airway so that someone cannot breathe. And because all of you are now adrenaline/epinephrine experts, you could see how using an EpiPen could counteract this by causing vasoconstriction of the peripheral blood vessels, increasing heart rate and increasing the force of contraction of the heart, thereby bringing the blood pressure back up. And obviously, opening the airways through bronchodilation is a very important effect of the EpiPen. Now, you technically don't have to use an actual EpiPen. They're just very convenient for use outside of a clinic. And personally, I actually haven't used an EpiPen on any of my patients because in the clinic, we just have a vial of epinephrine that will draw and inject the proper dose into a muscle during situations of anaphylaxis. So hopefully you learned some really cool information about epinephrine and adrenaline rushes. Thanks so much for supporting and watching our channel. And of course, we'll see you in the next one.